Hi, everyone. I am Nora McCardle in the Office of Policy Program and Legislative Initiatives in the Office of Public and Indian Housing. And I am here to talk about, I'm here with Laura Schumann of Enterprise and Scott Malik of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And what we are talking about today, as you know, is disaster planning. And so I'm going to start off by just going over again the PHA Disaster Readiness and Preparation Guide that we just published a couple of weeks ago, which hopefully you have seen. The guide was developed by reviewing continuity of operations plans and disaster plans from several PHAs, talking to PHAs that had been involved in disaster, and also drawing on the experience of HUD employees. And it's intended to provide basic information about creating emergency preparedness plan, continuity of operation plans, risk assessments. Again, this is not an exhaustive document. If you feel like there are things that it does not cover, I encourage you to reach out to me and at HUD, and I will, look into incorporating that into future unions. It's really just intended to be a starting point for you, not a end point. And so it is organized into sections on pre-disaster preparedness and post-disaster recovery. Pre-disaster preparedness covers doing risk assessments, coordination between you, your local government, state officials, federal officials, emergency responders, everyone and everyone. Resource and guidance development and partnership development, the organizations outside of your PHA that you'll work with, and of course, readiness, staffing, and training. And post-disaster recovery is organized into basically activation and development, what you do right when the disaster hits, how you start your assessments, developing your recovery strategy, both short-term and long-term recovery, and communication, information sharing, again, coordination with people who are going to be helping you during this recovery, and of course, transition back to normal. So some of the key points that to take from this guide is that you start with your risk assessment, which advises you to start by assuming that you will have little to no warning of a disaster, even though a lot of times you will have at least 3 days warning depending on the type of natural disaster. You may not be able to receive assistance from others right away because local government and local responders may be overwhelmed as well. The disaster will, have multiple cascading effects, i.e. the storm will knock out your power, so you'll have damage and no power, et cetera. And really, when you're starting this process, you're looking at 3 things, which is 1, your built environment. What does your housing stock look like? How strong is it? What are its weaknesses and strengths? Your in natural environment, where your housing and your HUV units are located, and what we call the social environment, or the barriers that your staff and your residents have in accessing services that you will have to work to overcome in the aftermath of a disaster, such as if you have a large elderly and disabled population that may not be able to get around very easily, or your population has a high number of people with limited English proficiency, or, so the social environment that your residents are operating in. Again, communication, you network before a disaster. If someone's throwing a dinner for disaster planning, go to it. Find out who locally is responsible for civic disaster planning. Get to know your fire department, your EMS responders, your police department. Coordinate with local agencies beforehand, and hopefully you will all be smoothly communicating after the fact because of your disaster communication. In addition, after a disaster, you have to assume that some of the normal communication networks may be down. Landlines or cell phones may be overwhelmed. So it's really good to have a central place that everyone can check in. If possible, often not, it should be something that is known, in advance. You said this will be our place and you can come here. Sometimes that place will no longer be available and you will have to redirect people. But it's good to also go out to the shelters to check in on your clients, so that, because there was an evacuation order, communicating with them often ensures that they will, who's been displaced, whose rent to abate, what their situation is, what you can do to help. And it's also key towards making sure that they remember that they have to communicate with you after a disaster, so that they do not lose their slot in your programs. So again, insurance, figure out what's covered, what's not. Really look into your flood insurance situation. There have been instances where PHAs, especially after Sandy, were not appropriately protected for flood, and therefore were not reimbursed for significant losses. And finally, training. Train your residents, train your staff, engage your residents, train often. Really think about what are the effects. If you can get your first responders involved in training exercises on your site, get your residents familiar with your first responders. That's a strategy that some PHAs have taken. Just make sure that people at least know what to do in a general sense, so that when it all spins out of control afterwards, at least they will have some training back to help. And now I'm turning it over to Scott Malik at FEMA.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Malik. I'm with FEMA, and I'm an emergency management specialist in the National Integration Center, which is a preparedness office. So I have to know a little about a lot, and that's why I'm going to provide you and reinforce those ideas that Nora has already talked about. FEMA provides a lot of assistance to state and local governments, including public housing authorities. Definitely fall under our purview, and you guys should reach out and use our resources. So I'm just going to take a short time to reiterate some of those main points that Nora talked about. Before a disaster, you have control. There are a lot of competing priorities in your workday, but the things that you can do to ensure success if you do face a disaster are continuity of operations planning. Make sure that you have a plan that works for you. There is templates available, and follow the principles, but if it's complicated and long and difficult to update and use, it's not going to be useful to you when you really need it. So, make sure you do a continuity of operations planning that fits your team and fits the size of your public housing authority. Training is available on the Emergency Management Institute website for free. There's a lot there. There's other courses that can be delivered in person. So I really want to, the other thing I want to reiterate is there are a lot of resources online. So please jot down the Emergency Management Institute. That's a FEMA training center, and they have independent study courses online that cover everything from continuity of operations to response. So great resource, free resource for you there. The biggie is flood insurance. Please go to the FEMA Flood Map Service. You can type it in Google. It'll be the only thing that comes up. Make sure that all of the buildings that you own and that you're responsible for insuring are not in floodplains. That website is fantastic. It's used, public and private individuals, homeowners use it. They have a great contact sheet, basically 1-877 FEMA map, and you will get a flood insurance mapping specialist and access to how the flood insurance program works. You'll talk to someone live, and they'll provide you great information about how to get covered for flood insurance, or whether or not you need to be covered if you're in a special flood hazard area. The other thing that's open to you all, may be open to you all, is hazard mitigation grants. FEMA provides mitigation grants to states, territories, and tribes, and those grants you can access through the state. And if you have a house, for instance, that is in a floodplain that you want to rise in a scattered site, or an apartment complex that you want to mitigate for flood, there is some money available. It is a competitive grant, but that's something you can do before disaster as well. Hazard mitigation grants can be found on the process, found on the internet. I think the most important, though, if you don't take anything away from what I've told you today, is connect with your city emergency manager, county emergency manager, parish emergency manager if you're in Louisiana, whatever the local jurisdiction emergency manager is before a disaster. Get to know them. They'll know about FEMA's mitigation grants and flood insurance process. How to do continuity of operations. They're a great resource to just keep this stuff fresh and for you all to know personally. And then quickly, that's what you can do before disaster. I'm a preparedness person, so that is really important that you take a few steps before a disaster, because during a disaster, you're going to be executing that continuity of operations plan and supporting your residents. And you're going to be communicating with the emergency manager, and they're going to want to know if you need any assistance helping those vulnerable populations that you house. And then after a disaster, maintaining continuity of operations, and identifying if FEMA has declared your county or parish or subjurisdiction a major disaster area, and so the FEMA programs of public assistance and individual assistance will be turned on. And you'll hear messaging about that if that's the case in your county. And then reimbursements for flood insurance and other insurance requirements. So you really, if you don't set yourself up for success before disaster, the during and after periods are going to be very difficult for you. So make sure you do continuity of operations plans that work for you. Get the training that's provided for free by FEMA online to you and to your staff. Make sure you're not in a flood hazard area, and if you are, ensure that you got flood insurance. Use FEMA's flood mapping service. See if you can use hazard mitigation grants to deal with any risky buildings that are in flood plains or not appropriately built for wind, and you can do a lot of reinforcement that way, and connect with your city and county emergency manager. So those are the four big points. I will be online and would love to answer any questions that you have, and you can contact me. So thank you very much. Pass it on.
Good morning, everyone. This is, thank you so much, Nora and Scott. That was a great introduction to what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm really happy to introduce myself. I'm Lori Schumann. I direct the resilience work for Enterprise Community Partners, and we have a very special a commitment to making sure that all of you out there are prepared, because you are housing some of the most vulnerable residents around the nation. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we are going to dive into a set of tools that we developed to support the emergency preparedness of multifamily housing organizations, and they are intended to support your efforts to build an emergency plan. As Nora reviewed the guidance that HUD developed, what we're going to be discussing today will actually provide you with the tools and templates that will enable you to build out your emergency plan. And so we're going to go into some of those specific tools. All of them are online and they're free, but I'm going to give you all a nice overview of what they are and how you can go forward and actually build your plan. So we're going to quickly recap what we talked about last week. For all of you that were on the call, it'll be a bit of a refresher, and for those of you that weren't, you'll have a little bit of an overview of where we're coming from, and then we're going to dive right into the tools that we've created. But first, I want to say thank you to everyone who took the survey that we provided you with last week to ascertain what your emergency preparedness needs are. We're going to go through the survey results in a minute. I first want to say welcome to the community on the call today. We have almost 190 public housing authorities on our call today, and more coming in as we speak. And the top housing authorities, like last week, are coming in from Texas and Florida, North Carolina. Those are the top 3 states. And it's no wonder, because these are the states that have really been hit with some recent flooding and disasters. And we're still, North Carolina is still very much dealing with flooding, and Louisiana with Baton Rouge and Texas. So this has been a very trying summer for many of you. And so we have a very large community on the phone, and you can all learn from each other as you go forward. So again, thanks for taking the survey last week. It was called the Are You Ready to Respond? It's on the Tools for Resilience website. If you haven't taken it, you can still take it. It's an ongoing survey, but I wanted to review some of the top results from the folks that took the survey. So we had about 100 participants from the PHA network that took this survey to ascertain your readiness, and a couple interesting points. About 75% of the respondents reported that you were not fully prepared. That basically means you don't have an emergency plan. 65% of you reported that you're not fully prepared in terms of planning, communication, and engagement with residents. And then about 48% reported that you need support in building preparation, specifically your infrastructure and resident engagement. So there's a clear need among this group to really dive in to figure out how to build plans that will respond to your business continuity, your infrastructure, and your residents. And if anyone's interested in the full results, you can email us and we can share those with you offline. But clearly there's a lot of question about how do we build our plan. And so right now we're going to go and get into it. So here's a brief recap. What are we preparing for? As Nora and Scott made clear, there's events that we know that are going to be happening. There could be a storm, there could be a flood, and then there's events that come at us without any advance notice, like a gas leak, an explosion, infrastructure failing. And so we know, indeed, that climate change, climate impacts are a growing threat. All around the country, there are fires and drought and flooding. I mean, it feels like it's almost overwhelming sometimes to think about all the potential scenarios that are happening concurrently. Just to restate, there have been over 209 major declared disasters in just 3 years. And so the expense to the communities and federal government is exceeding anticipated costs and rising exponentially. So for you that steward portfolio of properties, it's really important to think about your risk. If there were to be an event, do you have funding in your reserve account to support recovery? And many of you don't, because you're operating on very slim margins. So that's why it's particularly important to invest in your staffing response and preparedness to mitigate risk and financial impact. And so the reasons we want to be ready to respond are clear. We want to protect our properties and reduce risk to our vulnerable residents. Many of you steward housing for folks that are aging in place, or families with children, folks with special needs. So you want to make sure to reduce risk to those individuals and residents. Also, make sure to reduce risk to your business line. Your business continuity during an event is critical to keep in place and afterwards, because if you don't have your business continuity in line, you can't pay for your property to get repaired. So there's a real clear connection between your business continuity and everything you're doing. And then again, reduce risk to your community. What is really clear is that a lot of you are providing anchor services in your community and housing for folks that have particular needs. And so if your services go down or your housing fails, it becomes an impact to the larger community. So instituting all the protocols we're going to discuss today will help you support your continuity of service. And again, like last week, we talked about identifying your hazards. What kind of hazards are you preparing for? What are the risks to your portfolio, your residents, and your community should these hazards occur? And what are your strategies? and your risks are many: flooding, extreme temperature, storm, fire, failing infrastructure. Many of you have particular risks based on your jurisdiction. Always include your residents and staff when you're assessing your risks. You may not know that you have a staircase in building A that is failing, but your residents will tell you that it is, or that there's a flooding issue that occurs in this basement because your staff members constantly pumping it out. But you want to make sure to incorporate all of these folks in assessing your risk. And then understanding the impact to your building, your residents, your community, and your business line. Every event has an impact, and so you want to know what impact you're going to be able to support, and the impacts can be large scale, they can be critical, or they can be mitigated easily through operations and maintenance. And again, who are we planning for? This is why we're doing this work. We want to protect the most vulnerable residents out there, and so it's important that as landlords and operators of housing, you have a plan in place, because this is what matters. Okay, so we developed a disaster staffing toolkit with support from HUD. It took us a couple years to put together. It's a complicated kit. It's been informed by multifamily housing authorities from around the New York, New Jersey region. We worked with partners after Superstorm Sandy, to develop a staffing plan that would help really respond to the needs of the multifamily housing community. And I want to give a special thanks to the Jersey City Housing Authority. They may be on the phone today, who was really helpful in terms of informing what the staffing toolkit would be. And basically what this is it's a whole assortment of tools that are online to support your planning process. And the toolkit is based on the Incident Command System framework that's adopted by FEMA and all of the other first responder agencies around the nation, because we think that it's important that you as PHAs, critical partners in your community, can speak the same language that your first responder partners can speak. And so that we think is important. It's also great. We think it's a great framework. And so the toolkit materials have, there's videos that you can show your staff on ways of getting prepared and how to move forward with your plan. We've got coordinator tools. We've got a user guide. We've got job action packets and PowerPoints and agendas and everything you would need to know and have in place to build your plan. The goals of the tool are, as we've stated before, protect your building, protect your residents, and make sure your business continuity is online during and after a disaster. And the capabilities that this toolkit is emphasizing and what you'll be able to do when you use this tool and develop your plan is you'll be able to first figure out how to coordinate in a unified manner across departments and with external stakeholders. So you're going to be able to figure out how you're going to coordinate with your local police department, with your housing division and your resident engagement service division, with your executive division, as well as your building division. You'll be able to create a map that will help link you to all of your divisions and create more of a seamless management structure. And I will say, as an aside, what we're going to be doing and what you're going to be doing is a best practice asset management activity. So everything you do in your emergency planning preparedness efforts will also help you run your business and your organization better. The second core capability you'll be able to put into place is communication. In the world of social media, where things are basically broadcast immediately, you want to make sure you have communication in place internally, as well as how you message out your event externally. So this is important to make sure you are connected during an event and that you're connecting others during an event. And then finally, information sharing. Having your plan in place will allow you to provide vital updates to your residents, your leadership, your board, as well as staff that are trying to manage the disaster. So let's begin. The key person you're going to want to have appointed to help you with your preparedness, we're recommending, is what's called an emergency preparedness coordinator. And this is a staff line that can be either internal, you can hire someone to do this from outside, you can hire a consultant, but this is basically your project manager for your emergency preparedness efforts. This person's sole duty is going to be putting together the plan. She or he will manage the development of the plan, prepare staff for the roles that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, and then oversee ongoing maintenance. Now, once you get your plan in place, their role becomes more diminutive, but essentially you want to have someone who's going to be able to set the goal of building the plan and then get it built. And that's going to require someone whose, focus is there. And, if you can get someone in that knows the organization, you can build your plan a lot quicker as well. Now, the framework it looks like this. This is basically an ICS charting of roles. And what we've done is adapted the ICS chart to the needs of multifamily housing organizations. And this is a planning framework that basically allows you to appoint staff, give them responsibilities. It's very top-down, so everyone has a role that they played during the disaster, and it allows management to happen and decisions to be made in a very coordinated way. And it also allows you to have people in place where they're accountable for certain things. Accountability is really critical during a disaster because you need decisions made quickly and you need decisions to be carried out. So this kind of format, we think, can help you situate that. We're going to talk about each of the roles in a minute. Now, for each of those disaster roles, we've got a job description we provide you, job action sheet, as well as tools to support that job. And for everyone on the call, please note we will be taking questions at the end of the session, but I'm going to give you a review of everything. So write down your questions. Now, each role has a job description sheet, which really outlines exactly what their function is and sets the perimeters of their work. And you can customize it and adapt it, but this is a foundational document. And then the job action sheet basically chronicles their duties at particular operational periods. So you're going to want to know what they're responsible for before the event. But we're going to want to know what they're responsible for like 24 hours out before the event, during the event, 24 hours after the event, and then in recovery. So that's a critical part of the job action sheet, and then the tools, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to go back to this chart for a minute. If you'll notice, there's the incident commander role at the top, and then it cascades down to two sections, which is the business continuity section and then the housing section. Those are run by chiefs, and then under the chiefs, you've got leaders. And so this is the way that the ICS structure works, where you've got commanders, chiefs, and leaders. And each one has a certain level of authority. One of the most critical roles in your staffing chart is going to be your incident commander, because your incident commander is the staff person where the buck stops. They call the shots. They're the one who basically initiates the response team. They're the one that makes all the critical decisions at the highest level. This is not necessarily going to be your executive director. The reason why we have a separate line for incident commander is because your executive director, during an emergency, may need to be doing work to support funding, the board, dealing with the mayor. They may not be the best person to be running your response. I'm going to emphasize that because your executive director is not, we've had stories of the executive directors, making breakfast for volunteers during an event when they should have probably been out trying to get funding to come in to repair the damage that was done. So we think that this is an important role. This could be someone who's the housing director, someone who's trusted person in the organization, but they basically direct the response. You'll see on the right there's a bunch of tools that we provided, and they will to the incident commander that will help them do their job. The next role is the external communications liaison, and they're going to be working closely with the incident commander and the executive team to direct and approve all the messaging that comes out of the organization, out of the PHA, to media, funders, and government agencies. We know that your residents will be messaging their partners and their family, and that's going to be happening, but you want to make sure the organization has a very clear strategic message that you put out during the emergency so that you can make sure that that's managed well. This external communications liaison could be on staff, it could be it's a person you work with, a publicist, but it's an important role. And then we've got the business continuity chief. So I'm going down to on the lower left-hand side, you'll see a green section, and that's the business continuity section. We thought green was an appropriate color. Essentially, the business continuity section is the section of staff that keep the business running during the emergency. And so the chief oversees all of the duties that are included in the business continuity section. They are essentially reviewing cash needs, making sure that your insurance broker is online to deal with the event. They're also making sure you've got your insurance in place before the event. So each role has duties before the event, during the planning phase, as well as during recovery. They're overseeing all the important financial records and matters, and they're also making sure that you're going to be successful in getting your reimbursements in a timely fashion from FEMA and your insurance company, because that's really critical to make sure that that money is going to be flowing back into your organization. They've got a lot of responsibility, and they've got a lot of tools. On the right-hand side, you'll see a whole slot of tools that we've developed to support their work. And in part of developing those tools, we've been also coordinating with folks in the marketplace, insurance industry, and vendors to make sure that the tools we develop are responsive and realistic. One of the tools that were developed to support the business continuity chief is on insurance. So we know that this is a major issue for many of you. What kind of insurance do you need? So we've developed an insurance coverage guide that essentially details what kind of insurance you might consider. It details what the description of different kinds of insurance and riders. We provide you with a checklist that you can bring to your insurance broker, that you can walk through and figure out, okay, is this the kind of coverage I need? Are these the kind of limits I need? Do I have insurance that will cover mold? Do I have insurance that will cover, it's called code compliance, insurance that will allow me to be able to rebuild to current code? What level of flood insurance do I have? And the other question is, are my residents covered? So the guide is pretty comprehensive, and it's been reviewed by several partners from the insurance industry. And then we provide you with an insurance coverage worksheet, which is a Word doc, and you can basically take it out and check off that you have this and that coverage, what your premiums are, who the contact is to liaison with after an event. Now that coverage worksheet is really great to distribute to everyone on your administrative staff that is working on the business continuity section so that they know what you're insured for. The guide also covers what you should be doing to prepare for an insurance claim, so where you should be storing information about your systems and your materials and your equipment. The next set of tools we've developed to support the business continuity section is on establishing and formalizing your list of vendors and partners so that staff understand who you got online to provide you with the generator, for example, who your plumber is from the outside if that's not on the staff, who some of your vendors are around, leasing cars or snow removal, or other functions that you don't have a staff person online for. And what the vendor partner contact list allows you to write up is who the vendor is, who the contact is, their phone number, and then, what their contract is, and if it's online. So those are the things you want to know. And then we have another guide, which is on vital records. So this is a critical issue. Where are all your vital records stored? If you have Section 8 tenants, for example, in your facility, you want to know where their vouchers are. You want to know where the income verification documents are for your tenants, since you're verifying every year. If you lose those paper records, you might be in trouble because, you need to have that in place every year to be able to claim reimbursement. So this is a guide on identifying all your vital records. And one thing I'll share is, now that we have the access to the cloud and to online server to support and host our information, it's important to get all of this stuff into electronic form as best as you can and get it on the cloud so that you can access it from your office, or if the office is actually damaged, you can actually have access to those records. So move what you can to the clouds. And then, make sure that you do it in a very strategic way. All of this is part of the purview of your business continuity line. And again, just to emphasize, when you're doing this work, you're also streamlining your organization's asset management. It's best practice business operations to have this stuff in place. And so this is going to, if anything, improve how you operate. So that's the co-benefit of putting together this emergency plan.
Just remember, especially for PHAs, because this is Norma Cardle, we have a lot of what we consider very personal information on our clients, their records. It's not just the leases, it's the 5058s, they have personal identifiable information on them. Those need to be safeguarded the way they would be if they were in paper copies, limited access. If you're going to back them up, the security has to be very tight on those, because again, someone hacks those, they can learn a lot about your tenants, which could allow them to take advantage both of you and of your tenants. So you really have to be careful about what you keep online in terms of whether or not there's info in there that's personally identifiable of your tenants.
Thank you, Nora. And we're actually going to talk about how to engage your tenants to get information as well. The housing section. So the housing section, and let me just step back a second. The business continuity section, again, includes the business continuity chief, and under the business continuity chief, you have the IT team leader and the human resources team leader. We'll talk about those roles in a minute. Flipping to the other side, we've got the housing section. The housing section is directed by the housing chief. The chief will direct the building protection and resident engagement team leaders to focus their efforts on emergency preparedness and response. So the housing chief is the critical director of both infrastructure and resident engagement during an emergency and up to planning for the emergency. Now, many of you have scattered site housing. You also have multiple buildings. So the housing chief can either oversee, all of those buildings with team leaders stationed at each building, or the housing chief can oversee those buildings with one designated staff person appointed for resident engagement with all those buildings, and one person appointed for infrastructure support for all those buildings. So there's a couple different ways you can structure your housing section. And then if you have social services, there's another idea that we can talk about how you can structure that as well. The housing chief oversees resident engagement, and I wanted to talk about some of the tools that were developed to support your resident engagement, since you've voiced that as a need And since this is something that Nora has described very clearly in the guidance that HUD created, so the resident engagement team leader reports to the housing chief, and this person or persons are basically responsible for engaging your residents and making sure that they're protected and safe during an event. Now, there may be an evacuation called. That may happen. So the resident engagement team leader is working with residents, getting evacuation in place. All of that happens under the resident engagement team leader. They've got a whole bunch of tools that we've created to support their role, including a job description, as well as a video that outlines what they do. And then we've got a bunch of tools that we'll talk about a few right now. One is the resident survey. How many of you know who your most vulnerable residents are formally? So there's a resident survey that we developed with housing organizations to basically pass out and find out which of your residents need certain services during an emergency or what their vulnerabilities are. This is a Word doc. You can customize it. We have disclaimers on this that basically say to the residents, this information is going to be well guarded. But this basically gives you a sense of what your risks to your residents are. And then you can take all that information and import it into the resident services contact list. So this is something that's very useful because if your residents have evacuated, you want to make sure to track them, because if you don't track them, you will not get reimbursed for their rent. So this contact list is very important, and as Nora has mentioned, it's important to track your residents, even if they are evacuated.
And again, just sorry to jump in again. And again, this is, some of it is not personal information. Emergency context isn't. But if, for example, you're asking if someone is mobility challenged and things like that, again, this falls into how you would treat anyone who has a disability. The same regulations apply. You cannot ask the nature of the disability. You're supposed to ask the reasonable accommodation that they will need from you to evacuate in an emergency. So you treat it the same as you would any other information or that you're asking of your tenants. And it's a voluntary form, and you have to tell your tenants it's a voluntary form, that this is not a mandated form that they do. Certainly, NYCHA has a form that's kind of similar. They had a lot of sign-up of people after Sandy, developments that after Sandy were affected. They tend to use forms like this more often because they know how important this is.
Now, your evacuation tracking sheet, we provided you with a template. It's a Word doc. You can upload it and customize it. You may want to work with your residents, and we actually have a whole section on forming resident leadership committees. New York Housing Authority certainly has been working on doing a lot of this great work, but really using your residents to track each other as well, and that's an idea that they know best who's vulnerable and who's not. So the evacuation tracking sheet's available for you to use, as well as an emergency update flyer template. So we heard from lots of housing organizations around the region that they wanted a standardized way of updating their residents during an emergency. You can take this template, you can post it on the door with the flyer form, and you basically just update it every couple days if you need to. And you can use it for a variety of emergencies. And then finally, we've got a go bag tool that we've developed that you can actually pass out at resident meetings. It's a very fun, colorful tool. We've got it translated in Chinese and hope to translate into Spanish soon, which outlines what your residents can do to prepare. We know that go bags are something that we've been talking about around the country for a long time. Get your go bag ready. Get your systems in place for residents before an emergency happens. But the go bag is really important, and one of the features of the go bag we think is important is getting all of your basic information, your credit cards, your benefits information, your health card information, all of that, and getting that onto the cloud so that residents can access their information if they're evacuated. And so we emphasize this through the toolkit, that that's important, so residents have access to that important, vital information. That's part of your go bag. Then there's the building protection team leader. This is the leader that reports to the housing chief, and they're dealing with all infrastructure in the building. They're the ones that are going to be dealing with your boiler, your sump pumps. If there is a fire emergency, this is the staff person that's just working on that. They're not working on resident engagement. They're not working on insurance. They are working on trying to get your facility back online as soon as possible. And there's some tools that we developed to support that line. There's the building shutdown and reopen checklist, as well as the critical vendor contact list. So before I said the business continuity section has a list of the vendors that you work with. Well, they have the list of vendors you work with, the contract numbers and the names, but the building leader has the list of their phone numbers. So this is a critical thing to put into place so that they are able to call in professional support if needed. We also provide you with the building emergency kit worksheet. This is important. An emergency kit at the building is a critical part of your recovery. And what the building kit would comprise of is everything from flashlights to bleach, safety glasses, hearing protection, and gloves. We think that it's advised to have something like this in place at your facility for every facility, so that you have something should there be an emergency. And you know, many of your staff persons will have some elements of this already in place. So you can take this checklist and just work with them to make sure that, you know, you've got everything and that you know where that is if there should be an emergency. And we have a guide that we created with building operators to build that kit. And, you know, included in the kit is a backup power source so that you have something in place. So again, all these tools are created with the intention of helping you guide your efforts to get prepared, but by no means, you know, can't they be customized. The resident engagement team leader reports to the housing chief, and this is the person who's working specifically with residents. Like I said, each staff position has particular functions and is accountable for certain areas of your emergency preparedness effort. The resident engagement team leader has a lot of responsibility. They're working with the residents on evacuation, on social service needs, on making sure that folks have supplies if they need that, on updating the residents on your status of your event, and evacuation tracking. So all of those duties come in under the resident engagement team leader. And we've seen with social service organizations that we've worked with that the resident engagement team leader's role can be expanded to also include oversight of volunteers coming to your buildings. The resident engagement team leader can also be, their role can be expanded to make sure you have social services coming in to your facility if you want that. And again, all of this work that you're doing to prepare your organization and your facilities for disaster can also be translated into preparing your organization for best practice asset management, so that all of this can be used through the course of your business and not just in emergencies. I want to emphasize that. This is an investment in your asset management if it's an investment in anything. Finally, when you've gathered all of those materials that your EPC or your emergency preparedness coordinator is going to be managing for you, you're ready for a training. The training in the incident command system parlance is called a tabletop exercise. If you've all seen, you know, news broadcasts during an emergency, you'll see there's a situation room often. If, you know, President Obama's called into service for an emergency event, he'll often go to a situation room. There's the tabletop exercise is a way to get you in the mindset of getting of having to respond to an emergency. So it's a mock review of a potential emergency. It tests your ability to respond in accordance with the plan that you've created. It includes a simulated disaster scenario that you'll choose. It could be a flood, it could be a hurricane, it could be a terrorist attack. It tests the strengths of each of your job and staff specifically that have been assigned during the emergency. And it lets you practice your communication between roles. This is an opportunity to essentially sit down with your emergency team for 2 hours and run through the emergency. You're going to have someone who facilitates your conversation, and we provide you with a PowerPoint for the tabletop. We provide you with an agenda, and you also are provided with an after-action report, which helps you figure out what the gaps are in your emergency process. You can make a tabletop very fun. You can, have it during an event day. Like recently, a lot of folks had tabletop exercises during the Sandy anniversary last week. You can make it part of a, staff team morale boost. You can order food afterwards. And so it's a moment to really test drive your plan and see where you can improve. And you should do this once a year so that you test drive what you've developed. And so this is the kind of capstone to your efforts after you've developed the emergency plan. So the timeline for this is essentially you can get your plan in place as quickly or as slowly as you put effort in. You can, best case scenario, appoint an emergency preparedness coordinator who will get you oriented. They'll assign the disaster staff roles with your executive team. So they'll choose who should be the housing director, who should be the business continuity chief, housing chief, who should be the business continuity chief, and then on. She or he will help those folks customize their job action packets and customize all those tools. And then she's going to help you hold the exercise. Hold that tabletop exercise with the EPC, and when you're done with the tabletop exercise, you've presumably got your plan. And so, this could take, if you've got all your information organized now, it won't be a big lift to build your plan. If you don't have your systems in place, it'll be a little bit more difficult. And then the timeline for ongoing maintenance is you hold your regular tabletop exercises once a year. You have your after-action reports if there's an event. When staff leave your organization, you want to make sure you replace that staff line with someone who comes in. And you want to update your materials regularly. So your EPC should be an ongoing administrative role that you have in place to make sure your plan is updated and coordinated. And, it's a great thing to appoint someone to be that ongoing EPC because there's actually a lot of skill and a lot of staff development that can come into play with that. So I'm going to close there. We've just covered a lot of material, and we're going to send you the link to the Disaster Staffing Toolkit after the seminar today. But that's essentially an overview of what has been developed to support you and your efforts, and it also complements the HUD guidance very specifically. So with that, I'm going to now open up to questions about anything that we have discussed.
Okay, thank you, Lori. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And several people have asked so far how they can get copies of all these materials.
That's a great question. We have the staffing plan on the Enterprise Community Partners Ready to Respond website, and all of these materials are actually available free of charge. In fact, well, I don't know if I'm going to show you right now because I don't want to screw up the PowerPoint, but they're all available on the Ready to Respond Tools for Resilience, and everything's organized by section. So actually, I'll just pull this up really quickly. Donna, can I share my screen?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I'm going to just pull this up. Okay. So I'm going now to the, I'm going to just walk everyone through this. The Enterprise Community Partners Ready to Respond Tools for Resilience. Again, all of these tools were funded with support from HUD. So we've got the first page, which is sort of the overview of the staffing toolkit, and there's a video here. It's a 4-minute video, and it gives you an overview of what the actual staffing plan looks like. And it's a great video to share with your executive team, your board of directors. Even I'll recommend sharing with some external staff in your mayor's office, because you want to make sure your, the executive leadership in your community is aware of your emergency planning preparedness efforts. I mean, it really is a great thing, and it should be a point of pride to say to your executive administrators in your municipality and jurisdiction, I'm putting in some effort to develop an emergency plan, and to make sure that you're aligning with the family of city agencies in your jurisdiction is a great thing to do. So this video is excellent to do that. And then you're going to want to press get started, and then there's going to be the emergency preparedness coordinator roles, and then under here are all your disaster response roles. And you can see each of the roles we've talked about, and then there's going to be, under the business continuity chief, there's going to be a whole set of documents that you can just download for free from the website. And each of the roles has this. Now, you may say, I'd like to just download the whole thing, and you can do that. You can actually download the entire disaster staffing toolkit right here, and it gives you all of your roles and all of the tools. In fact, I would recommend that, because you can really just peruse everything and pull out what you want. I do want to make the point that, this is a very extensive toolkit that we've developed. And what you can do if you want to, basically make it a little bit easier, if you want to just pull out chunks of the toolkit, you can do that. You can customize the toolkit to fit your needs. And to fit what your situation is. So if you're a smaller PHA, by no means, and you have maybe 4 staff on your team, by no means do you have to do this entire exercise. There's items you can pull out to support your efforts. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Next question is, what is the difference between the SEMS and NIMS response models?
Oh, that's a great question. Scott, are you still online?
I am still on the line, yeah.
I'm going to defer to you on that.
I'm actually not sure what SEMS is, but I do know the National Incident Management System is the way that, and my office is responsible for updating that, and there'll be a new one out this year, new update, not too many changes. But it talks about how the nation will respond to hazards. And so it lays out things like resource management, command and management, public information, and it provides best practices, and an all-nation approach about how to respond to disasters. So, and I'm not familiar with SEMS, so Linda, if you want to provide more information on that, I would love to hear it.
And I'll just say, one of the great things about having your plan be consistent with ICS framework is that you will be able to speak with common language with your first responders. And it's also helpful that when FEMA comes into your community to support your efforts, you can also speak with them with common parlance, and you can introduce your incident commander to their incident commander, and there's more of a synchronicity and more of an understanding of where, how you're framing your staff response. We're often finding that multifamily housing has such particular needs, and there's particular attributes to multifamily housing that are not always easily understandable by first responder agencies, only because, we have very particular needs. We have social services, we may have seniors in place, we may have folks that are, sheltering in place, don't want to be evacuated, so it's really good to have that common language in place.
Correct, yeah, and this is Scott again. So I looked up, I believe SENS is what California calls their response model. Everyone uses ICS, including California, the incident command system, and again, like Lori said, it's really being able to speak that common terminology and understand each other during a disaster, so that that there is clear and consistent communication. And so NIMS, the National Incident Management System, and SEMS use ICS as their baseline for response. So you're set there.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Laurie, I believe we were going to try and call it at 10:30 for today's session, or did you have some more to continue on?
Well, I'm just looking at some of the folks that have been called. We got a couple emails from folks that do sit on emergency planning councils, and your PHAs have COOP plans, and you've connected with local bus companies to move residents. We will say that it's, you have to figure out what your level of support is going to be during an emergency, and that's one of the first things we recommend you doing, is trying to figure out, what could and should residents expect from you during an emergency, and make sure you communicate that out. For example, if you've got residents with supportive service needs, and you're not prepared to provide support for them during the emergency, you should be very clear with them about what they can expect from you and what they can't, because it puts you in a situation of having residents make the assumption that you're going to be able to provide food and provide social service and all of that. And if you're not prepared to do that during the emergency, there's going to be a major disappointment there, leading to breach of trust and a variety of issues. So when you start this process, it's important to figure out all of the things we talked about in the last session, which is what are your impacts, what are your risks, what are you willing to do, what can you do, and communicate that out to your residents. And we strongly advise that you use some resident engagement meetings as an opportunity to talk about what their expectations are as well and what they need, because if you can't provide that support, you're going to want to figure out potentially how to not only message that, but maybe identify folks that can provide that support. So, your Red Cross is always available to speak with you about needs after an emergency, but you might want to reach out to them in advance and say, look, we've got a lot of folks with disabilities at our facility, and we're going to need special dispensation or special accommodation. And you're also going to want to know, where your local evacuation shelter is too, so that that residents with pets or residents with ADA needs have a space to go, because you don't want to be in a situation where your residents don't have a place to go if there's an evacuation.
Great. We have gotten a few more questions in. One question is, we have so few employees. How do we fill all these roles?
That's a great question. Here's what we would recommend. If you download the entire guide and peruse it, we would recommend that you pull out the sections and the tools that would best help you support your residents and your buildings and your business continuity you don't have to assign a staff member for every job. You can coordinate and consolidate roles as well. If you're a smaller organization, your staff will be playing many roles. So, there is the short version and the long version of this exercise, and the short version is really just pulling out the tools that you think would fit you best and working with those. And we might, we've been asked this question before, and we put together our top 10 list of tools that, if you're interested in, email us and we'll send you those.
Okay. Our next question is, do you have an exercise guide for emergencies without warning, like an earthquake?
That's a great question, and that gets back to the point that Nora and Scott made earlier, which is you don't want to be planning for your disaster when the disaster has hit. You want to have your plan in place so that when there is an earthquake, which is, disastrous potentially, that you've got your systems in place and you're ready to go. You want to have everything in place so that, the point of preparing is to have those systems ready so that when you have to deploy them, you're able to do that. And so we're advising that if you go ahead and build this plan and have the critical information in place, your vital records, your building shutdown, your building reopen list, and all of those, if there's an earthquake that hits, you'll have the information at your ready. Now, we haven't talked about it today, but there's a whole host of work you can do to improve your infrastructure and mitigate. And FEMA, as Scott mentioned, has some really incredible tools to help you figure out how to mitigate your buildings from seismic shock and wind and flooding. We also have a tool for multifamily housing on infrastructure, and we can certainly share that with you, and we do give trainings on that as well. And it is available on the Ready to Respond Tools section.
Excellent, thank you. Our next attendee says she's confused about some of this. Doesn't the Red Cross coordinate services for their residents? And county disaster people determine evacuation centers, which can change depending on the disaster or event?
They do, and you should be in contact with your representatives from both of those cohorts so that you understand where the evacuation centers are and what kind of services are available. Because we're not suggesting that you create those. Those are operated and run by external groups like Red Cross. But what we are advising is that you know where those are and you know at least who to talk to from the Red Cross. At least have a point of contact from your local Red Cross chapter. Because they'll do all the heavy lifting on the evacuation and they'll do all the work on helping identify shelters. But it's great to know, what's out there. And again, have a point of contact. In fact, I'm going to emphasize that it's great to have a point of contact for every first responder agency out there with your police, your fire, your medical, your Red Cross. And we have a sheet that will help guide that in there. But it's good to have that point of contact because if you need to call them, you can.
Plus, even this planning actually will help you for what aren't really even disasters, but situations like power going down in one of your buildings. So if power goes down in one of your buildings for an extended period of time, it's, or there's a fire that's localized to one building as opposed to a city or community-wide disaster, that's a different situation, but it's also something you should be prepared for. In that case, are you responsible for evacuating? The Red Cross may not be involved, and so you may need to identify common areas in other buildings that you can take residents to. So that kind of like if you have a heat-related thing, you need, those are the type of low-level things that preparing for big disasters can always help you with.
Great, thank you.
Scott. This is Scott from the National Immigration Center with FEMA. It's some of these, you don't want to make any assumptions either. The Red Cross does do a lot of the sheltering, but there are other organizations that can help you. So my word of warning would just be don't assume, and if it is with the Red Cross, make sure you reach out to them, like many have said, and have a direct point of contact and make sure any memorandums of understanding that you might want to develop are in place and reviewed. So I think it's great, just great practical knowledge to maintain those relationships.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is, are there standards for how long power is down before that plan goes into effect?
So, and you, Scott, please correct me if I'm wrong, and this is a point of some debate. You know, how long should we be prepared for if power or anything goes down? And the 3-day mark is generally seen as like the time it would take for first responders to get to you. You know, the point of emergency preparedness and the issue around an emergency is sometimes you don't know what you're planning for. And I think, Nora, you said it beautifully last week, which is, you know, there's a lot you don't know during an emergency, so that's why you really want to make sure you have your systems in place. You know, we do have a whole section on backup power solutions in our infrastructure guide, but, you know, power, if it's down for an hour and you've got a person that needs medication or is on oxygen in a unit, that hour could be the difference between whether he or she makes it or not. And so having power in place as your backup is critical, and that's part of your plan. So having emergency power is a critical part of your infrastructure emergency plan.
And I would reiterate that 72 hours is just a rule of thumb. But again, you guys provide services to a vulnerable population that might not have the extra time or money to develop that 72 hours of supplies. And there are a lot of people maybe with medical conditions that they can't wait like an hour, exactly what Lori said. So I would not use that rule of thumb. I would say if people need power to survive, then it needs to happen immediately, that the power restored or find them a new place to reside with the services that they need.
And on the infrastructure guidance that we provide, which is, you know, we didn't review it today, but there is a whole section, again, on backup power, and also there's a section in there on how to determine your critical loads at your building. So when you're powering or determining your backup needs for your building's power supply, you know exactly what critical loads you need to power up. And you may need to power up, you know, plug load for cellular equipment, refrigerators, a community room, an elevator. So that's an important thing to be thinking about. And that's, again, part of the building protection housing section guidance.
Excellent. Thank you. We appear to have run out of questions coming in. Lori, Nora, or Scott, do you have any final wrap-up words for us?
This is Scott. Thank you very much for allowing me to attend. It was a great session. I think there's a lot to learn and to prepare for.
Just from my point of view, again, thank you for attending. We hope that this is useful. All of the info and documents today are really tools to help you. They're not mandates, but this is an area that clearly, if you've called into this thing that you think is worthy of exploring of your time, please reach out if you have any additional questions, and we appreciate your time.
And I'll just conclude by saying we really appreciate your feedback today, and we really appreciate your time, and we're always available to help you think through some of your actions. You can email us at resilience@enterprisecommunity.org, email any one of us, me, myself, Nora, or Scott, and we can help you think through some solutions.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, Lori, you have the last word. Thank you to all of our panelists today, and especially to you, our attendees. We hope to see you online at some time soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.